Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Okay, welcome everybody to this episode of the CPath podcast, where we connect the dots between science, medicine, and drug development. Today's episode is going to be focused on our 20 years of innovation and connecting the dots between our reflection on our legacy and looking ahead at the future. Today, I'm joined by our President and Chief Operating Officer, Kristen Swingle. Kristen, hello.
Hello. It's an honor to join you here, Klaus. I haven't had the opportunity to participate in one of our podcasts, but today we're going to turn the tables here, and I'm going to take the lead on asking a few questions because, as you know, this year, as we wind down 2025, we have been celebrating our 20th anniversary, and you have been such an instrumental part of our organization. For those listening at home, Klaus is actually our longest standing employee at Critical Path Institute. And so who better to take us a bit on the journey of what we've accomplished over the last few years, a couple of decades, and also maybe tee up what we're thinking about for the next couple of decades. So with that, some folks may still be wondering who CPath is and what we do. So maybe you can shed some light.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So the Critical Path Institute was incorporated in 2005. So that's why we're celebrating 20 years this year. We were created in direct response to a truly visionary document that the FDA published in 2004. So we were incorporated a year after the Critical Path Initiative document. This is the name of the document from FDA was published. Hence the name. We started out as a nonprofit that was founded to help FDA materialize the vision of what was laid out in the Critical Path Initiative document. That document is truly visionary because this was the time when the FDA came out publicly and declared two obvious things, but then an obvious conclusion that had not been fully addressed. The first obvious statement is that the FDA has the mission to regulate medical products. The second obvious statement is that industry has the mission to develop the products. But the third statement, which is a conclusion, but that had not been addressed, is the question of, okay, so who has the mission to make the process efficient for everyone? It can't be just FDA. It can't be the individual companies trying to innovate on the process and making the process efficient for everyone. So the FDA had a visionary idea to call to action for the formation of public-private partnerships that would bring together industry, academics, advocacy groups, and naturally regulators to work together to make the process efficient for everyone through identifying what the bottlenecks were and what type of scientific innovations were needed to remove the bottlenecks. So that's what we do at CPath. We set up public-private partnerships that work on identifying the bottlenecks in the process and generating the actionable science that can remove them. And we've been pretty successful the past 20 years, but the world evolves, and now we need to look ahead.
So when you say we've been successful, how have we actually impacted, as you say, we've impacted the process. We are tasked with making the process of drug development quicker, more efficient. How have we done that? What are a couple of examples that really stand out to you?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kristen, for that question. So there's a couple of things, and I'll start at the end. If we are to work on making the process efficient for everyone, naturally, we've always been tasked with dealing with areas that are becoming really challenging for drug development. And areas especially where either there were no treatments at all available, or there was stagnation in the development of new products for such an area, or the area was becoming so challenging that people were threatening to divest from even thinking about developing products in those areas. So we have been able to transform areas that had those challenges of essentially being a wasteland, a desert of no movement and no new approvals, into areas that are thriving. For example, Alzheimer's disease, several rare diseases like Friedreich's ataxia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, orphan status indications like tuberculosis and polycystic kidney disease, and some really public health relevant areas like type 1 diabetes prevention. In all of those areas, now we have not only new approvals of medical products, but more importantly, a healthy pipeline of new drugs being developed. That's the biggest example of a transformation. Now, how do we transform that? Because we've been able to uniquely integrate data from industry, academia, patient groups, and electronic health records, and turn those data into the actionable solutions that remove the bottlenecks from those areas. Those are the most tangible examples of how we've been successful.
Okay. So a couple of those solutions that you mentioned, right? So let's talk about in clinical trials where a failure of a clinical trial may occur, and it was unclear whether or not the failure was the result of the compound or the therapeutic that was being evaluated, or if the clinical trial design was not sufficient to effectively evaluate efficacy and safety. So, and you know, the impact in particular, say, that that has had in the Alzheimer's space.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame the situation, Kristen, because if a clinical trial fails to demonstrate efficacy and safety, you'd think that it's because the test product was either not efficacious or not safe. However, a trial may fail to demonstrate the efficacy and safety of a new medical product because there are issues with how the trials were designed, how the endpoints for efficacy and safety behaved, how the population that participated in the clinical trials were selected, or the underlying variability in said population and in the biological behavior of the disease and the interplay with the treatment. That was so bad in the 2004-2005 era that it was estimated back then that more than 80% of those trials that failed to demonstrate efficacy and safety didn't demonstrate efficacy and safety because of issues that had nothing to do with an actual flaw in the efficacy or safety of the new product. And that's where we came in, and in the power of integrating the data from the trials that were successful and those that were not successful, and looking at all the information in one place in a neutral way, in a transparent way that allows you to diagnose where the issues were and how to generate the science to solve them is a demonstration of how the critical path initiative vision from the FDA was a sound one and how we came in and put it to work.
Fantastic. And I think another example, just to provide some variety for those that may be listening. So there are instances where therapies are being are available and would like to be evaluated, but there's not a qualified or appropriate or even consensus on how to effectively measure changes in biology to know if the drug is having an effect. So you mentioned total kidney volume and polycystic kidney disease. Can you maybe share a little bit about that example?
Yeah, of course. So this is an orphan status indication where there were no specifically approved products to manage the disease. Physicians were smart enough to use medications that were approved for other indications to help manage some of the consequences of those accumulations, abnormal accumulations of fluid in the kidneys of those affected with the disease, would cause problems with blood pressure and electrolyte imbalances, etc. But there was no direct treatment for the disease itself. And the other challenge is that our bodies are pretty savvy to adapt to conditions. So as the fluid was accumulating those individuals with polycystic kidney disease, the kidneys just start adapting, and they adapt, and they adapt, and they adapt until they cannot adapt anymore. So there's a long journey of the actual tests that measure renal function staying normal and normal and normal as the kidneys grow in size, and that growth becomes so apparent that people with the disease start growing bellies that are essentially made up of the enlarged kidneys. So people can see that there's something wrong with them, and they feel it. And they have all kinds of issues with their daily activities. And yet the tests for kidney function remain normal. So there was a need to find a way to capture how the disease was actually behaving biologically inside the body. And what better way of capturing that than through imaging of the kidneys and understanding how they were growing, at what rate, with what variability. And that's what we set out to do with the support from the PKD Foundation, the support from FDA, and the partnerships with industry. And several academic groups that were leaders in the field of polycystic kidney disease. And we integrated the data that were available at the time, and we started looking at developing that quantitative description of how total kidney volume changed over time. And that became the foundation for eventually the first imaging biomarker for this disease to be endorsed, to even select people to be in the trials. And then it became the main endpoint by which today every drug for polycystic kidney disease is measured. And that's an example of the transformation from no approvals to the first approval to now a healthy pipeline of more than 13 drugs being evaluated for the disease.
Fantastic. So you just highlighted a few of the entities or parties that we work with. So, getting stakeholder buy-in and engagement and consensus across industry and patient groups and regulators. Can you talk a little bit about how CPATH has been able to make that happen?
Yeah. When we started, one of the first comments that I heard as I was recruited when the organization was very young was, oh yeah, good luck. I mean, you'll never get to the academicians to talk to the FDA, and you'll never get industry competitors to talk to each other. So we acknowledge that, of course, that was the state of play of things before the Critical Path Initiative and before CPATH was founded. But credit goes to the vision of our founder, Ray Woosley, who set out to think through why was that the case in the first place. So the first thing was the notion that there wasn't a uniquely neutral, in that context, organization that could provide the safe harbor for all those partners to come and share information. So now we have, after 20 years, we have a very solid legal pillar that sets up the neutrality for that space to actually be a tangible space where everyone can come together. The second piece is, okay, now we have the legal framework covered. Now we can come together and we share information. Everybody has day jobs. Industry has day jobs. They are developing the products. FDA has day jobs. They're evaluating the products. The academicians need to do their scholarly work. So what do we do in this neutral space? It starts with identifying what the unmet need is. And that takes us, CPATH, to talk to the partners to identify what are their pain points. And of course, look, I'm a clinician, so as the saying goes, you can take the clinician out of the clinic, but not the clinic out of the clinician. This is very much like treating patients. When you talk to individual patients, they'll describe symptoms. I have a headache. I can't sleep at night. I have shortness of breath. But if you just go with the symptoms, and for the headaches you prescribe painkillers, and for the shortness of breath you prescribe an inhaler, you're not doing your job right, because you're not diagnosing what is the actual cause of those symptoms. So we start with just understanding what are the symptoms of the problem as perceived by every stakeholder, and then in conjunction with in the neutral space that we provide, with the dialogue that we have with everyone, we diagnose exactly what the underlying issue is. That's the unmet need. And once you have that, then you can formulate a treatment plan. And that's the exciting part about the second pillar, which is the scientific infrastructure that we provide, so that we understand what kind of science we need to work on to address the true bottleneck, the true unmet need that is plaguing everyone. That is what piques everyone's interest, to say, okay, now everyone has a day job, but this is going to facilitate my day job, because now I understand that uniquely in this neutral space, we can solve that headache. And then the third pillar is, of course, the regulatory aspect. The fact that we have the regulatory agencies participating in the neutral environment to have a direct dialogue as to those key topics that are plaguing everyone in drug development, and the science that we generate to remove those bottlenecks and address those unmet needs gets reviewed by the regulatory agencies, and then that provides the necessary confidence for the solutions to be adopted by everyone, because as our founder also liked to say, solutions that are not adopted are not solutions.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's a little bit about, the external partners that really help make this happen. Why don't we talk a little bit about the internal team? So, Klaus, you were employee number
12.
12. Okay. We are now at 160 employees. We've got 13 in Europe. And so, what's the profile of a CPATH employee? And that's a loaded question, because there's a lot of profiles of CPATH employees. Right. So I'm just curious, what is the kind of the talent and the skills that are needed and that we have here at CPATH to really help bring forward all of the solutions that you just articulated? Right.
So it's that could be a loaded question, but it could also be just a question to describe a pretty unique human collective. Mm-hmm. If you were to ask me what is the common denominator of the people that work at CPATH, is is the following. Number one, we're talking about people that really want to have impact with the work that we do every single day, regardless of the roles that anybody plays at CPATH, from an operational role to an IT role to an actual scientific role to regulatory. We're all working towards solving issues that can positively impact the lives of those people living with diseases that need treatments today. So that's the first characteristic. We are all aiming towards having that impact on people's lives. The second characteristic or common denominator is people that have a desire to work in an environment that will never be boring, aka never be the same year after year or even month after month, and are prepared to navigate that seeming uncertainty, but which in reality is a very intellectually motivating environment every single day of our work. And then the third part is individuals that really want to have rigor in the work that we do, because we have to present the solutions that we generate in a highly regulated environment, because the science needs to be extremely rigorous. If you're going to say this is the new way of identifying people that need to participate in trials, that's a serious matter. Or if you say this is the new way to measure if a drug is actually working in this indication, that's a serious matter. But that cannot happen without the fourth characteristic, and that's the willingness to collaborate, the need to not feel well if we're doing things in a vacuum on our own.
Fantastic. And I wholeheartedly agree with the description of the team that we have here at CPATH, who are is like no other. We're truly lucky to have the opportunity to work with the team that we do. Klaus, as we've talked about how CPATH has, kind of had its roots and how we've grown over the last 20 years, by and large, or at least at the onset, right, we grew out of interest in particular therapeutic areas and stakeholders wanting to solve for the unmet need in those particular areas. However, we have some pretty diverse therapeutic areas that we now have public-private partnerships. We also have consortia that are not focused on a particular therapeutic area, but are truly subject matter experts in the particular tools that consortium is tasked with developing. And so there is a thread throughout our consortium of really our core competencies. And so maybe talk a little bit about what those core competencies are that really kind of unify and run throughout the organization.
Right. So the core competencies are at the core of everything that we do. The 5 core competencies that we have defined are the 5 areas that allow us to be very portable and generate solutions that can solve bottlenecks in essentially any drug development area. The 5 core competencies are the following. And the first one was one that was developed out of necessity, but it is a fundamentally core expertise that we have. Everything data. Everything from data standardization to data management to data engineering to data science. That has allowed us to build the kind of data and analytics platform that we have, that currently includes more than 720,000 individual records from sources like trials from industry, including the active and control arms, observational studies from academia, patient registries from patient groups, and electronic health records from hospital systems globally. The second core competency has to do with what you do with the data. So it's everything pertaining to advanced analytics, mathematical modeling, statistics, pharmacometrics, artificial intelligence, etc. That's the core competency that allows us to transform the data into actionable knowledge that becomes the foundation for the solutions that we are known for. But those analytics have to always take into account the third core competency, which has to do with everything biomarkers. There's a lot of dynamic changes with the underlying pathophysiology and biology of diseases that we should always quantify in terms of their dynamic sources of variability, etc. And this is a plug for the podcast that we recorded with our VP of Quantitative Medicine and Model-Informed Drug Development. Because the understanding of those dynamics is key. But also in biomarkers are key for translational sciences. And what is that? How do you translate what you see in the lab to what you expect to see clinically as you're developing those products? And safety is key there. And so everything I do with safety biomarkers is at the core of everything that we do, on top of the efficacy biomarkers. The fourth one is the other type of measurement that you need to capture in order to understand efficacy and safety. And that is our core competency in clinical outcome assessment. That's the core competency that allows us to understand how to incorporate the voice of the patient into everything that we do, and how to develop or optimize instruments that allow you to properly measure how the patients are actually doing in their participation in clinical trials, and how to use that information to better inform drug development and regulatory decisions, which turn, as the foundation, turn into what you see in the drug labels that get approved. And then the fifth one, which is the wrapper for all the other four, is our core competency in regulatory science, which is the integration of all those disciplines that can be put to use to better understand how to make decisions, not just for drug development, but for regulatory reviews. With those five core competencies, we've been able to tackle all those drug development areas. And so we have groups that are, as you were pointing out, Kristen, disease-specific but solution-agnostic. The Type 1 Diabetes Consortium, the Alzheimer's Consortium, the Polycystic Kidney Disease Consortium, etc. They work on a specific therapeutic area, and they work on data, resources, biomarkers, outcomes, quantitative solutions, and regulatory science advances. And then we have groups that focus on a specific type of solution but are disease agnostic. Examples of that are the Patient-Centric Evidence Consortium or the Predictive Safety Testing Consortium. They focus on, respectively, clinical outcome assessment tools for efficacy or biomarkers for safety for a myriad of therapeutic areas. And then we have a third flavor of collaboration that are both disease agnostic and solution agnostic, like the collaboration we have in neonates. Plug for you to go back and listen to the podcast that we had with our VP of Pediatric Programs. And the rare disease efforts that we have that are both disease agnostic and solution agnostic. So that's how you can imagine the complex matrix that we have, but it's really simple. It's the five core competencies at the service of many drug development areas.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic, but I know we've only scratched the surface, so don't miss part 2 as we continue the conversation around CPAS's 20 years of impact.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org.
That's c-path.org.
Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.